The chamber did not go silent when we walked in. It went still. There is a difference. Silence is the absence of sound. Stillness is what happens when 1,000 different species, breathing through 17 different kinds of organs, all stop moving at once because something has entered the room that does not fit any category they have prepared for. That something was us. My name is Yale Oren. I was 34 years old when I stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council for the first, and as I believed at the time, last time. The hall was built inside a hollow asteroid that had been carved out over 600 years. The ceiling was so far above us that clouds formed up there, actual clouds lit from within by bioluminescent organisms the Kaith had seeded into the air supply as decoration. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. It was also the place where I was about to watch my planet be sentenced. There were 4 of us at the human table: me, our science liaison Dr. Pete Calloway, our trade representative Nina Foster, and our legal observer, a quiet man named Dan Gray, who had said almost nothing during the entire 3-week journey to the station. I had taken that silence as calm. I later learned it was grief. Dan had known before we left Earth how this would end. He had read every precedent. He had not said anything because he did not want to take hope from the rest of us before we needed it. The Arbiter, Chief Salvathine, was a being of considerable presence. He was tall in a way that did not seem anatomically possible, 8 limbs arranged in a bilateral symmetry that almost looked like a human design, and then didn't, a head that held 4 light-sensitive organs arranged in a ring, and a voice that came from somewhere in his chest and arrived in our translation earpieces as something warm, measured, and completely merciless. He began reading at the 3rd hour of the morning session station time. I remember because I had been awake for 22 hours by then and was drinking something the catering staff had assured me was coffee, and which tasted nothing like coffee. Pete was taking notes. Nina was watching the delegation from the Keth Consortium across the wide circular floor. Dan was reading the room with his eyes, slow and methodical, like a man memorizing a painting he would never see again. The charges took 40 minutes to read aloud. Unregulated expansion into unclaimed systems without council filing. Atmospheric contamination exceeding council environmental thresholds by a factor of 9. Arms proliferation to non-council species in restricted sectors. Failure to submit to the standard biological integration assessment. Refusal to attend 3 consecutive council mediations regarding the Frontier incident. Each charge was followed by a pause. I think the pauses were designed to let us absorb the weight of what was being said. What they actually did was give me time to think. I thought every one of these charges is true. I also thought none of them capture what we actually are. The penalty was announced at the start of the afternoon session. Quarantine, full embargo, no council vessel would dock at Earth, no Earth vessel would be permitted to enter council space, no trade, no communication relay, no emergency medical access, no technology exchange. Indefinite, pending a full council review that would be scheduled per standard protocol within the next 120 years. The chamber was quiet, the waiting kind of quiet where everyone is watching too See what you do next. Pete put his pen down. Nina folded her hands on the table. Dan finally spoke. He leaned over to me and said very quietly, Yale, you have 30 seconds if you want them. Procedural. Rule 41 subsection C. Any condemned party may address the chamber for 30 seconds before judgment is sealed. I looked at him. You knew about this the whole trip? Yes, he said. I was saving it in case you needed it. I stood up. I requested the floor. Arbiter denied it. I cited Rule 41. Subsection C. There was a pause, a very long pause, and then Solvathine nodded. I had 30 seconds. I did not argue. I did not present evidence. I did not beg, which I think was what most of the chamber expected. I looked at the arbiter and at the ring of watching faces and light holograms and light organs and sensor clusters beyond him, and I said, You have made a tremendous mistake today. I sat down. The chamber did not stay quiet this time. There was sound of several varieties, most of which my translation earpiece rendered as amusement. Delegate from the Keth Consortium said something that came through as, the small creature believes the mountain has stumbled. There was more laughter after that. Solvathine sealed the judgment. He did it with a physical gesture, pressing both of his upper hands flat against the dais, which I later learned was the council's formal gesture for closure, finality, and the ending of discussion. I picked up my materials. Pete closed his notebook. Nina uncrossed her hands. Dan put his pen in his coat pocket with the careful precision of a man completing a task. We walked out. Not quickly, not slowly. We walked the way you walk when you are not afraid and you are not defeated, which is just the way you walk when you have decided that the room behind you no longer matters. I heard the chamber continue behind us. Business as usual. Other matters on the docket we were already filed in. Forgotten. Pete came up beside me in the corridor, which was a long silver tube with soft amber lighting and the distant sound of the station's environmental systems breathing around us. He said, They're going to be surprised. Yes, I said. How long do you think before they realize? I thought about that. I thought about my mother, who had grown up without running water and had figured out at the age of 9 how to build a gravity filter from river clay and sand. I thought about my neighbor back home in Tel Aviv, who ran a community solar collective from his garage and had never once applied for a government permit because he said the permits would take longer than the problem. I thought about every war humanity had survived, every plague, every famine, every collapse of every system we had ever built and then rebuilt and then built again differently. 6 months, I said, maybe less. Pete nodded. He looked like he was trying not to smile. We should probably get back. There's a lot of work to do. There was. We had no idea how much. But we walked to the ship, and the ship took us home, and home was still there. Still complicated and loud and full of people who did not know yet what had just been decided about them and who would not when they found out stop. That was the thing about us. We never stopped. Solvathine had sealed the judgment. He had pressed his hands flat against the dais. He had made it final. He had not, in 600 years of presiding over the endings of civilizations, ever presided over one that simply went home and got to work. He would learn what that meant. They all would, but not yet. For now, I sat in the small cabin of our ship as it pulled away from the station. That blotted out 3 stars, and I opened my notebook and I started a list. The list was titled, Things We Already Have. It was a long list, longer than I expected, longer than anyone on that council would have believed. I wrote until I ran out of pages, then I borrowed Pete's notebook and kept going. Outside the window, the council station grew smaller and smaller until it was just a point of light among thousands of others, and then it was gone, and we were heading home, and I was not afraid. I was, if I am being completely honest, a little bit excited. The list was very long. The first sign came from a street in Lagos on day 11 of the embargo. I know this because I was monitoring communications that morning, sitting at a folding table in the temporary coordination office we had set up in a converted warehouse in Haifa, drinking actual coffee this time, when a message came in from a woman named Claire. Adami. Claire was a biochemist. She was 26 years old. She had never worked for the government, and she had just synthesized a functional analog of one of the 3 pharmaceutical compounds that had vanished from Earth's supply chain when the Council's embargo snapped into place. Not a perfect copy, not stable at room temperature for more than 48 hours. Without refrigeration, not the kind of thing any regulatory body would have approved in normal times, but functional. It worked. The people who needed it could take it, and it would do what the original had done. Her message to me was 4 sentences long. She said, I figured out how to make the Ayurvex compound from Earth native amino chain precursors. The yield is about 60% of the licensed version, and it degrades faster, but it works. I've published the synthesis process online. You should probably tell people to check their refrigerators. I sat there for a moment looking at that message. Then I forwarded it to our medical coordination team, flagged it as priority 1, and started crying, not from sadness, from something I did not have an immediate word for. Relief was part of it, recognition was part of it. It was the feeling of watching something confirm itself, of watching a thing you believe to be true become visible in the real world. Day 11, 11 days of embargo, and a 26-year-old with a lab bench and a connection to an open access research database had already begun rebuilding one of the supply chains the Council thought they had severed. That was the beginning. After that, things moved very fast. The Council had calculated the embargo based on a standard dependency model. They had looked at what Earth imported, identified the critical supply points, and assumed that severing those points would create a cascade of failures that would bring us to the negotiating table. Within 18 months, the model was sophisticated. It had worked on 14 other civilizations. It accounted for industrial capacity, population needs, technological level, and political stability. It did not account for the way humans respond to the word no. Pete Calloway, who had become effectively my second in command at the coordination office, once described it to a visiting Hallan observer this way. Most species, when you cut off their sources, begin conserving what they have. Humans do that too, but simultaneously. A different part of the human population starts trying to manufacture what they've lost, and a third group starts asking whether they actually needed it in the first place. All three things happen at the same time independently without coordination. It's chaotic and inefficient, and it produces results in timelines that don't make sense. He was being modest. It was not just inefficient problem solving, it was something more than that. It was a cultural reflex so deep that most of the people doing it did not even know they were doing it. Let me give you some examples, because the list is how I understood what was happening, and lists were how I stayed sane during those months. A shipyard in Incheon, South Korea, run by a man named George Park, began retrofitting older freighters to run on a reaction mass formulation that cost roughly 12% of the Kethan imported fuel they had been using. The fuel was less efficient, the ships were slower. Nobody cared. George told me later that his workers had been unhappy with the dependency on imported fuel for years, and had quietly been developing the alternative on their own time. The embargo, he said, had just given them a reason to stop keeping it quiet. In Tucson, Arizona, a retired electrical engineer named Helen Cross, 61 years old, had been sitting on a redesigned energy cell for 3 years because the council-licensed version was under an exclusivity agreement that made her version legally complicated to sell. When the embargo hit, the exclusivity agreement became irrelevant. She published her schematics on an open access server on day 19. By day 30, manufacturers in Brazil, South Africa, Taiwan, and Finland were producing it. By day 60, the price of energy storage in those regions had dropped by 38%. In a small town in Argentina, a cooperative of 12 researchers who had been working on council-licensed atmospheric processing equipment figured out over 3 weeks of very long nights how to replicate the core function using components that could be manufactured from materials available on Earth. Their version was larger, louder, and required more maintenance. It also did not require a council license, a council inspection, or a council-approved technician to service it. They published their design too. Everyone published everything. That was the other thing the council had not modeled. Humans under pressure stopped protecting intellectual property, not out of altruism necessarily, but out of a shared understanding that the problem was bigger than the profit. The council's intelligence reports, which we did not have access to at the time but which I read later, are fascinating documents. They are full of phrases like unlikely at this scale and timeline inconsistent with known capacity, and recommend verification before acting on this data. The analysts were not incompetent. They were simply using models built on the behavior of species who, when pressed, became more careful. Humans, when pressed, became more numerous. The number of people working on embargo-related problems tripled in the first month. By month 3, it had increased by a factor of 20. People who had nothing to do with the affected supply chains were solving the problems anyway, because the problems were visible, and humans, when they see a visible problem, have difficulty ignoring it. I was running the coordination office by this point with a team of 9 people operating out of the warehouse in Haifa, and we had become essentially clearinghouse for solutions. Solutions came to us from everywhere. Some were practical, some were not. A man in Glasgow sent us a 17-page document proposing that we resolve the pharmaceutical shortage by teaching everyone on Earth to grow medicinal herbs in their apartments. It was not practical. It was also not entirely wrong. We filed it under partial credit and moved on. What we were actually doing in those months was something that had no official name. It was not government policy. It was not a military operation. It was closer to what happens when a river encounters an obstacle. The water does not stop. It finds every available path around, under, through, and over the obstacle, and eventually, the obstacle is no longer the relevant feature of the landscape. I had a conversation around month 4 with a council observer named Vet. Vet was not from a hostile species. Vets, people the Sorathi, had been council members for 300 years and were, as far as I could tell, genuinely decent beings who believed the embargo had been the correct decision and were also increasingly unsettled by what they were watching. Vet came to me officially and asked me politely when Earth intended to submit its compliance request. I told Veth we were not planning to submit a compliance request. Veth was quiet for a moment, then Veth said, "But the embargo." "Yes," I said. "You are aware that the embargo is still in effect?" "Completely," I said. "And you are not complying?" "We are not trading with council members," I said, which was true. "We are solving problems within our own territory and publishing the results openly. If other species find those results useful, that is their decision." Veth looked at me for a long time. Sorathi have one large central eye and several smaller sensing organs, and when they look at you with all of them simultaneously, it is a remarkably comprehensive feeling. Finally, Veth said, "You are not afraid?" It wasn't really a question, but I answered it anyway. "We've been afraid before," I said. "It doesn't stop us. It just adds a kind of energy to things." Veth filed a report. I know what was in it because Veth told me years later that they had written, "Recommend the council reconsider its dependency models. The embargo is not producing the expected behavioral outcomes. Earth is not contracting, it is expanding. This appears to be a structural feature of the species rather than a temporary response." Veth's superiors had noted the report and taken no action. They would eventually, but not yet. In month 5, Claridame's pharmaceutical analog had been refined by 14 different research teams across 3 continents and was now stable at room temperature for 6 days. Her original synthesis yield of 60% had been improved to 91%. She had been invited to speak at 9 different conferences. She had declined all of them because she told me she was busy working on the second compound. The warehouse in Haifa had become too small. We moved to a larger building, then a larger one. By the end of month 6, we had coordination nodes in 41 countries. The list titled Things We Already Have that I had started on the ship coming home from the council station had grown to 47 pages. I started a second list. This one was titled Things We Have Now That We Didn't Have Before. That list was growing faster. There is a space station in neutral territory between the council's outer boundary and what used to be called the unclaimed systems, which humans had taken to calling the open corridor. The station was built by a species called the Vreth about 200 years ago as a trading waypoint. It had been used for that purpose until the council expanded its border regulations 40 years back, at which point most of the legitimate traffic moved to council-approved ports, and the station was left to serve whoever didn't qualify for council-approved ports. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place where people gathered who the galaxy had decided to overlook. I arrived there 14 months after the verdict on a ship that was officially conducting a geological survey of the outer corridor, which was true in the technical sense that Pete Calloway had his equipment running the whole way. There, I arrived with no official title and no official purpose, which was also true in the sense that nothing I was doing had been sanctioned by anyone with authority over me, because at that point I had stopped recognizing any authority higher than the problem itself. I was there to meet 3 people. The first was a Vreth merchant named Rook. I say named Rook because Rook was the name he had chosen for interactions with humans, as his actual name required a set of vocal cords that humans did not have. Rook was small, even by Vreth standards, with dark fibrous coverings that shifted color slightly depending on his mood, and very bright eyes that gave him an expression of constant alert curiosity. He ran trade routes that had connected the outer corridor to about 40 small populations the council classified as developing and therefore not worth protecting. His routes had been disrupted by the embargo's secondary effects, not directly, but because the council had tightened its border protocols in response to what it called unauthorized humanitarian distribution, which was what it called the open publication of Helen Cross's energy cell schematics when smaller species started building them. Rook had been looking for a conversation with someone from Earth for 6 months. He found me because a Hallan archivist told him where to look, which brings me to the second person. Her name was Myra. She was Hallan, which meant she was built like a column, roughly 2 m tall with overlapping cartilaginous plates that served as both skeleton and armor, and 4 upper limbs that terminated in hands of extraordinary delicacy. The Hallan had been absorbed into the Council's sphere of influence about a century ago in a process the Council called integration, and the Hallan called something that translated approximately as the quiet taking. They had not been conquered. They had been made dependent slowly and methodically over 2 generations until refusing Council terms had become structurally impossible. They had not fought it. They were not a species inclined to overt conflict. What they were inclined to was remembering. The Hallan had a cultural practice of recording everything, not just history. Everything. Daily logs, administrative records, private correspondence were consented, meeting minutes, official votes, unofficial conversations that happened in the margins of official votes. Myra had been working as an archivist on the Council station for 11 years. She had access to records that no one had ever asked her to access, because no one had ever thought to ask whether the archivists were paying attention. They were paying attention. They had always been paying attention. The data chip she handed me across the table in Rook's private quarters on the station contained 300 years of Council voting records, including the private pre-vote position documents that individual members filed internally before the public sessions. It included communications between member delegations during active proceedings. It included specifically the deliberations that had preceded Earth's condemnation, and those records were illuminating in ways I had not expected. The vote had not been unanimous. I had not known that. It had not been close to unanimous. It had been contested by 9 member species on grounds ranging from procedural concerns about the speed of the process to substantive objections about the evidence. Those 9 species had been outvoted, and their objections had been sealed from the public record by a provision that allowed the majority to classify internal dissent as a council security matter. I read the files for 4 hours in a small room that smelled of the breath equivalent of machine oil. When I came out, Rook was waiting with something hot to drink that turned out to be neither coffee nor tea, but was warm and slightly sweet, and I was grateful for it. Useful? He asked. Beyond useful, I said. Myra said you would say that. He poured something for himself. She also said you would want to know about the third person. The third person was not in the room. He came in half an hour later, alone, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to take up very little space in public because taking up space had historically been costly for him. His name was Cole. He was Seth. The Seth were a species the council had formally expelled a century ago for reasons that the official record described as irreconcilable divergence from council developmental standards, which was a long way of saying the Seth had refused to share a propulsion technology they had developed that the council wanted access to, and the council had responded by removing them from recognized membership and placing them under a travel restriction that made it technically illegal for a Seth citizen to appear before the council. Technically illegal. Cole was here anyway, in neutral space, which was not covered by the travel restriction, and he had very carefully made sure he was in neutral space and not 1 cm into council jurisdiction. He sat across from me, and for the first 4 hours of our meeting, he talked about his people. I let him talk. The Seth had been expelled when he was very young, and the expulsion had been the defining event of his generation's life in a way that was different from how I had understood it before sitting across from Cole and watching him describe it. They had not been destroyed, they had been made invisible. When a species is expelled from the council, it does not disappear. It continues to exist in its systems, with its population, with its infrastructure, but it loses its codes. It cannot file a trade route. It cannot request emergency navigation assistance. Its ships are not recognized on council communications channels. It exists in a space the council has designated as not requiring attention, which means that when a Seth vessel has a crisis in deep space, there is no one to call. They had survived by being extremely careful and by helping each other and by building a parallel network of support among other expelled and overlooked species that the council did not bother to map because it did not bother to look. They sounded, I thought, a lot like us. After 4 hours of talking about his people, Cole reached into a bag he had kept beside his feet the entire time and placed a rolled data sheet on the table. He smoothed it flat with both hands. It was a technical schematic, dense with notation in Seth script, which Rook quietly translated as Cole spoke. It was a fold drive design, not the standard council-approved fold drive, which required a specialized mass core that council members manufactured and sold under license, making small ship travel effectively dependent on council Infrastructure. This was something different. It had been developed by Seth engineers 60 years ago when the expulsion had made it clear that dependency on Council infrastructure was no longer an option. It produced fold transit for a ship at roughly 40% of the mass core requirement of the Council standard. It could be built from components available through non-Council supply chains. The Council had become aware of it 30 years ago through an intelligence contact. They had formally requested that the Seth hand over the design as a condition of potential reinstatement. The Seth had declined. The Council had announced that the design had been destroyed in a Seth station accident. This was not true. The Seth had put it somewhere safe and waited. Why are you showing me this now? I asked. Cole looked at me for a long time. Because, he said, you are the first people in 100 years who are in a position that looks like ours, and because we watched what you did in the 6 months after the verdict. What did we do that matters to you? You published everything, he said. Every solution you found you shared. You did not protect it. You did not sell it. You gave it away. He paused. My people were alone for 100 years. Because we did not know how to find each other. You are building something different. We want to be part of it. I looked at the schematic on the table. I looked at Myra, who was watching me with the calm attention that was her species' natural expression. I looked at Rook, who had shifted to the particular color that I had already learned in 14 months of occasional contact was his version of hope. I thought about Dan Gray, who had sat in the Council chamber and said nothing and known everything and saved a 30-second window of speaking time for me in case I needed it. I thought about my neighbor in Tel Aviv, with the solar cooperative in his garage. I thought about Clara Damey, who had published the synthesis process and told people to check their refrigerators. I thought about Helen Cross, who had been sitting on a better energy cell for 3 years and let it go the moment it was needed. I said, we need to make copies of that schematic, a lot of copies in a lot of different places. Rook's color shifted again, this time to something warmer. That, he said, is already arranged. We talked for 6 more hours. By the end of it, we had the beginning of something that did not have an official name and did not want one. The Council mapped things by naming them and regulating the names. We prefer to be a thing that moved before it could be mapped. We left the station separately by different routes on different days. On the ship home, I added a third list to my notebook. This one was not about what we had or what we had built. It was about who we had found. It was a short list so far. It grew faster than any of the others. And somewhere in the records Myra had given me, among 300 years of Council votes and deliberations and private communications, I had found one more thing, a small notation in the margin of a procedural document from the session that had condemned us, a comment made by one of the 9 dissenting members, filed and sealed under the security provision. It said, this species does not behave like a threat, it behaves like a beginning. I copied that notation to the front of my notebook. It seemed important to keep it where I could see it. The Keth enforcement frigate that entered Earth's quarantine zone on the 419th day after the verdict was not there to start anything. I want to be clear about that because the way some people tell the story later makes it sound like a confrontation, and it wasn't, not exactly. It was more like the moment when someone who has told themselves a story for a very long time finally arrives somewhere that forces them to look at the story differently. The frigate was commanded by a captain named Overseer Class Administrator Drev, which was a title as much as a name. Among the Keth hierarchy, Drev had been given the assignment without enthusiasm. Compliance inspections were considered routine, even tedious within the council. Enforcement structure. You went to the condemned system, you assessed the state of deterioration, you filed a report. You came home, the report was expected to describe energy shortages, population stress, infrastructure decline. It was expected to be short. I was not on Earth when this happened. I was on a supply run to one of the outer corridor settlements. Pete Calloway was the one who watched it unfold through our monitoring systems, and he sent me a real-time message log that I still have. His first message said, "They're here. One frigate, they've dropped out of transit at the standard inspection distance." His second message, 14 minutes later, said, "Yale, they're doing a sensor sweep. You need to see these readings." His third message said, "I'm going to need a minute." What Drev's sensor systems had found was not what the model predicted. The orbital defense grid had not degraded every piece of infrastructure that had been in place at the time of the verdict was still operating, but around it, like new growth around old timber, there were 42 additional platforms, not purchased, not council licensed, built, earth fabricated using design principles that Drev's engineering officer noted with considerable surprise. In her own log were a hybrid of at least 3 different technological traditions that should not, by any conventional analysis, have been combined successfully. The platforms were crude. This was the detail that Drev kept returning to in his report. The platforms were crewed by humans on rotating shifts, not automated, not managed by AI systems, actual human beings living on the platforms, maintaining them, watching. The Keth and most council species used automated systems for orbital defense maintenance. It was more efficient. A machine did not need to sleep, did not need to eat, did not develop the kinds of small errors that accumulated from fatigue. Drev's engineering officer noted in her log that she initially assumed the crew presence was a temporary measure, perhaps a maintenance window. Then she checked the scheduling data. Her systems managed to access before Earth closed that access point, and she saw that the rotation had been continuous since the 4th month of the embargo. There had never been a point when the platforms were not crewed. She wrote, "This appears to be intentional. The humans seem to believe that a crewed station cannot be abandoned. I'm not certain this is an irrational position." Drev was doing his own thinking below. His sensors were giving him data that his model said was impossible, and his training said to flag impossible data for verification. But he was also a being of some experience, and his experience was telling him that sometimes the data was right and the model was wrong. He had seen 14 compliance inspections in his career. He had never seen a condemned world that looked like this. He adjusted his scan to the surface. What he found there was harder to categorize. The cities were intact, more than intact. They were active in ways his instruments struggled to classify. The energy output of every major population center had increased since the last survey taken before the embargo, not dramatically but consistently. The agricultural productivity metrics were above pre-embargo baseline. The medical infrastructure, which his model had flagged as a primary vulnerability because 3 key pharmaceutical imports had been cut off, was operating within normal parameters. His medical analyst pulled the data and came back with a finding that she triple-checked before reporting. The pharmaceutical gap had been filled by locally synthesized compounds, not perfect replacements but functional ones being produced at scale, distributed through a network his instruments could detect but not fully map because it had no central hub. It had no central hub. The distribution network had no center point that could be disrupted. It was fully distributed, running on thousands of small nodes, any one of which could fail without affecting the whole. His systems analyst had not seen that kind of architecture in a non-council species. She sent him a note that said, "I don't know if they designed this deliberately or if it just grew this way. Either answer is interesting." Drave sent a message to the council relay requesting a consultation with his superior. While he waited for a response, he continued his scan. Down in the city streets, his visual sensors picked up things he had not expected. Street markets where technology analogs were being sold and traded, community centers that were running skills training programs in systems maintenance and emergency response, schools where children were learning things that in his culture were specialist training reserved for credentialed adults. He watched one particular video feed for several minutes. It showed a street in a city called Cape Town on the southern end of the largest continent. An older woman, not young, not physically imposing, was sitting at a table in an outdoor space with 3 teenagers. She had components laid out on the table. She was teaching them to build something. His engineering officer identified the components as parts of a portable water purification system, not a complex one, not a cutting-edge one, but a functional one, and the teenagers were learning it from a woman who clearly knew it well enough to teach it without notes. He found himself watching for longer than was strictly necessary for the inspection. His superior's response came through. File the standard report, note any anomalies, return to station. Drev pulled his attention back to the task. He began composing the report. He described the defense grid expansion. He described the surface infrastructure stability. He described the pharmaceutical situation and the distributed supply network. He described the energy improvements and the agricultural metrics. And then he stopped. He sat with his report for a while. He looked at the data again. He looked at the video feed from Cape Town, which his system had flagged for inclusion as evidence of surface social stability. He added an editorial note to his report. His superiors later flagged this note as outside protocol. Drev had never added an editorial note to a compliance report in 17 years of service. The note said, "I recommend against attempting a landing inspection at this time, not because our forces are insufficient for such an inspection, because I do not believe it would achieve the intended outcome. The planet is not in the state of deterioration the embargo was intended to produce. If anything, it appears to be functioning with greater internal coherence than our pre-embargo survey data would have predicted, the humans are not waiting for the embargo to end. They appear to have decided the embargo is no longer the relevant fact of their situation. He paused, then he added one more sentence. I am uncertain what the relevant fact of their situation currently is, but I believe the council should find out before deciding what to do next. Drev's superior read the report. She noted the editorial addition. She flagged it for review. She filed the report under standard compliance records and marked the case for follow-up in 120 years for the original schedule. Pete sent me the sensor data as soon as he could compile it. I read it on the ship coming back from the outer corridor, sitting cross-legged on my bunk with a notebook on one knee and a cup of cooling coffee on the other. The thing that got me was not the defense grid expansion, although that was impressive work by people who had been doing remarkable things under pressure. It was not the pharmaceutical situation or the energy metrics. It was the woman in Cape Town. I did not know her name. I could not know it from a sensor scan, but I knew what she was doing. She was doing what my grandmother had done, what my mother had done, what human beings had done through every hard period in our long and complicated history. She was passing something forward. She was taking what she knew and giving it to the next set of hands, because that is what you do when you understand that the knowledge is not yours to keep. The council had built its strength vertically. Power accumulated at the top, resources concentrated at the center, decisions came down from the arbiter and spread outward through the member states and reached the people at the edges only when the center chose to extend them. We built differently. We always had, not by design, not by a policy anyone had written, but because the center for us had always been unreliable. We had learned a long time ago that the knowledge and the water and the food and the medicine had to live where the people were, because no one was reliably coming from somewhere else to bring it. I wrote in my notebook, they measured us by our warships and our vote count and our trade volume. None of those things are what we are. We are the woman in Cape Town and the 26-year-old in Lagos and the engineer with a garage full of solar panels. We are distributed. We are in every node. You cannot put an embargo around that. The embargo has to go somewhere. We are already everywhere it would go. I closed the notebook. The ship hummed around me. Somewhere ahead of us, Earth continued doing what it always did, which was continue. I thought about what Pete had written to me in his last message of the day. After the frigate, it turned around and went home without asking permission to land, without conducting the surface inspection, without filing anything beyond the standard scan data. He had written, I don't think they know what to do with us. I had written back, they will figure it out. It just might take them a while. It did, but the while was shorter than anyone expected, because the conversation Rook and Myra and Cole and I had started in neutral space had kept growing, and the data chip Myra had given me had found its way into the right hands, and the fold drive schematic that Cole had smoothed flat on the table in Rook's quarters had been copied as Rook promised to many places, and the world the council thought they had sealed off had been quietly and without announcement making itself very difficult to seal. Drev's frigate was the last compliance inspection the Council ever attempted on Earth. I do not think that was coincidence. I think it was the first moment the Council looked at what they had condemned and wondered for the first time if they had made the calculation correctly. They had not. They were starting to understand that. We gave them a little more time to think it through. The session was called by 9 Council members, not by us. I want to be clear on that point because the way some people tell this story, later they make it sound like humanity demanded a hearing, like we had come back to the chamber with demands and an ultimatum and a fleet of ships behind us. That is not how it happened. We did not go back to the chamber. The chamber came to us, or rather the 9 species who had voted against the original verdict and had their clear's throat objection sealed under a security classification, finally had enough internal political leverage to force a formal review session because their merchant populations had been watching the open corridor develop for 2 years and had started asking uncomfortable questions about who exactly the embargo was protecting. The answer, it turned out, was the same handful of Council members who had Council licensed the technology that Earth had stopped needing. I had the formal notification on a Tuesday morning. It arrived through standard diplomatic channels, which the embargo technically still restricted, but which the Council had begun using for communications with Earth in a kind of pragmatic informality over the previous 6 months, as the formal embargo had become increasingly difficult to enforce against the civilization that had restructured itself specifically to not require the things the embargo cut off. The notification said that a review session had been scheduled for 30 days. Hence, it said that Earth was invited to send a representative delegation. It did not use the word condemned. It used the phrase subject civilization, which was technically accurate and felt, I thought, considerably more uncertain. I called Pete, I called Nina, I called Dan Gray, who was retired now and living on the coast and who, when I told him we were going back, said, "I'll pack a bag." I called Rook through the secure channel we had established through the VRETH communication network. He said he would be there with his full delegation, which now included 4 other VRETH trade families. I called Myra. She said the Hallen archivists had prepared materials and were ready to present them formally on the record. I called Cole. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "We have not been in a Council space for 100 years." "I know," I said. "The travel restriction is still technically in effect. The Council's enforcement arm is also technically still in effect," I said. "And technically it turned a frigate around and went home without filing a landing request about 6 months ago from a planet they had condemned and embargoed." Another silence. "We will be there," Cole said. We traveled separately as we had before. We arrived at the Council station in groups at different times through different ports. The station was the same vast hollowed asteroid, the same bioluminescent clouds. Near the ceiling, the same amber corridors and breathing environment systems and careful, watchful delegations from 1,000 species moving through the halls. But something was different this time. I noticed it the moment we docked. The beings in the corridors looked at us, not with the comfortable dismissal of the first visit when we were small and known and categorized. They looked at us with something more careful than that, with something that had some concentration in it. We were not categorized anymore. We assembled outside the chamber doors. Our delegation was larger this time, not enormous, not threatening. Just larger, me, Pete, Nina, Dan, 4 others from the coordination teams who had built the things that were built and knew what they had built and why. Behind us, in the waiting area, Rook's delegation in their shifting color. Quietness, Myra's archivists with their Data, Cole, and 3 other Seth who moved with the particular dignity of people who had been told for a century that they did not belong in a room and had decided today was the day they were walking in anyway. The chamber doors opened. We walked in. The Arbiter Salvathine was at the dais. He looked the same, 8 limbs, 4 light organs, the warm and merciless voice, but he looked at us differently than he had looked at us 2 years and some months ago. I am not certain what the difference was. Exactly, it was something around the posture of his upper limbs, something the way his light organs adjusted when he saw how many of us there were. The 9-member species who had called the session were seated in their positions around the chamber's inner ring. The rest of the chamber was full. Every seat, every holographic representation, every observer gallery. I had not expected that. I had not expected the council to be watching in full assembly. I learned later that the session had become known about through channels no one had formally announced, that the Hallan information networks had quietly distributed the schedule through the overlapping species who used their archiving services, and that significant portion of the council had decided they wanted to see this person. Salvathine called the session to order. He noted the presence of the Earth delegation. He noted the presence of the Vreth delegation. He noted the presence of the Hallan archivists. His light organs passed over the Seth, and there was a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds, which in a formal council session is quite a long pause, and then he noted their presence too without comment and moved on. The 9-member species who had requested the review went first. Their representatives were measured and careful. They did not argue that the original verdict was wrong in principle, because that would have required challenging the authority of the arbiter and the majority, which had political consequences they were not willing to absorb. Instead, they argued that the embargo had not produced the intended effects, that this indicated a miscalculation in the dependency model, and that a recalculation was required. They used a lot of numbers. They were very thorough. It took 90 minutes. Then Salvathine looked at me. The Earth delegation may address the chamber, he said. I stood up. I did not have notes. I had not written a speech. Pete had suggested I write speech, and I had told him I would figure it out in the room, which had made him look exactly the way Pete always looks when he is worried, but has decided to trust me anyway. I said, I am going to play something on the dais with your permission. Salvatine gestured his assent. I walked to the center of the chamber and placed a data chip on the dais. It was a copy of the data chip Myra had given me in neutral space. It was also something more. It contained the pharmaceutical syntheses, the energy cell schematics, the fold drive design, marked clearly as developed by the Seth, with their full attribution, the agricultural biotech, the water purification protocols, the distributed network architecture, everything that had been built and published in 2 years of embargo. All of it packaged and organized and clearly sourced. It also contained Myra's 300 years of voting records, including the sealed objections from the 9 dissenting members of the original verdict, and a full, clean analysis of which council members held licensing rights to which technologies that Earth had been forced to develop alternatives to. I stepped back from the dais. That is everything we have made in the time since your verdict, I said. It is all publicly available. It has been publicly available since the day each piece of it was completed. We published it because we do not believe that knowledge should be locked away from the people who need it. We are not here today to ask for the embargo to be lifted. We are here to tell you what the embargo taught us and what we made from that lesson. The chamber was very still. You thought the embargo would teach us dependency, I said. It taught us the opposite. You thought cutting off our supply chains would show us how much we needed you. It showed us how much we already had and how quickly we could build what we lacked. You thought isolation would weaken us. Isolation showed us who else was isolated and gave us reason to find them. I looked at the section of the chamber where Rook's delegation sat. I looked at Meyer's archivists. I looked at Cole. The beings behind me, I said, are not here as our allies in a political sense. They are here because they have been waiting for 100 years and longer for someone to notice that they existed. We noticed. That is what humans do. We notice people that other people have decided not to notice. It is historically one of our most annoying qualities and also one of our most useful ones. There was something that moved through the chamber at that, not laughter, not the Keth delegates' comfortable amusement from 2 years ago, something more complex. I do not want anything from this council, I said. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not here with conditions. I am not here with demands. The data chip on your dais is a gift, not a threat, not a negotiating position, a gift because we believe information should move freely and because we have no use for holding it back. I paused. What I would like, I said, is for the council to understand something. You measured us by our wars and our failures and our waste. Those things are real. We have done all of them, but you made the mistake of thinking that those things were what we were rather than what we were working through. Every species has its difficult period. Ours happen to be very visible and very loud and very long. We are still in it in some ways. We probably will be for a while, but the measure of a people is not whether they fail. It is whether they continue after they fail. We continue. We always continue. It is, as I said, one of our most annoying qualities. Salvathine was looking at me with all 4 of his light organs. I had learned in the time since our first meeting that this was not a hostile gesture. It was the Cath equivalent of full attention. I said, we are not asking to be part of your council. We are asking to be left alone, to be what we are, and I am telling you that whether you grant that or not, we will be what we are. The data on that chip is already in 400 places. The drives we built are already in the corridor. The beings behind me are already talking to beings you have never mapped. The world you thought you had sealed has been, with great respect, doing exactly what it has always done. I walked back to my seat. Dan, who was sitting at my left, leaned over and said very quietly, "That was about 600 words, more than 30 seconds. They gave me more time this time," I said. The session continued for 3 more hours. The Myria's archivists presented the sealed voting records, which caused a considerable amount of disruption in the chamber and required Solvathine to call for order on 4 separate occasions. The technical analysis of the council members' licensing interests in the embargo, which Pete had quietly compiled over 8 months from publicly available trade records, was entered into the formal session record by one of the 9 requesting members and created the kind of silence in the chamber that has weight to it. The vote to lift the embargo was called at the end of the session. It passed not unanimously. 7 of the major member states voted against it, including the Keth Consortium, but it passed, and the reasons it passed were not all noble. Some of the members who voted for it did so because they wanted access to the open corridor network that had developed outside their control. Some did so because their merchants were losing market share to alternatives that Earth had published for free. Some did so because they had read the frigate Captain Drev's report and had reached the same quiet conclusion Drev had reached. The embargo was no longer lever, it had become scenery. Some, I think a small number, voted for it because they had read the Seth engineer's attribution on the fold drive schematic in Myra's sealed voting records and had felt something about a civilization that would give credit to an expelled species and publish 3 centuries of embarrassing council history for free. The session closed. Solvathine sealed it with his hands flat on the dais. Same gesture, the same finality, but pointed in a different direction this time. We filed out into the corridor. Rook walked beside me, his color shifting towards something that I now recognized as contentment. Myra's archivists moved in their quiet group behind us. Cole walked with his 3 colleagues. Forsyth in a council corridor for the first time in a century, walking like they belonged there because they had decided they did. In the corridor, Solvathine caught up to me. He had come without retinue, which I learned later was unusual. He walked beside me for a moment without speaking. When he spoke, he kept his voice low, enough that the translation carried only between us. "I have been arbiter for 60 years, he said. I have presided over the closing of civilizations. I have watched species plead, strategize, and collapse. I have never watched one simply go home and do this." I did not know what to say to that, so I just kept walking. "I would like to understand," he said, "what the source is of this, the continuity of it." I thought about it. I thought about Clara Damie and her 4-sentence message about checking refrigerators. I thought about Helen Cross and 3 years of patience and 1 day of letting go. I thought about George Park's workers quietly developing alternatives on their own time because they didn't like depending on something they couldn't control. I thought about the woman in Cape Town, whose name I still didn't know, teaching 3 teenagers at an outdoor table. I thought about what it was that connected all of those people to each other and to me and to Dan Gray, who was walking a few steps ahead of us with the careful pace of a retired man who had saved a 30-second speaking window for 2 years on the off chance we needed it. "You kept asking what our greatest weapon was," I said. "You were looking For a ship or a strategy or a particular technology, those are things you know how to measure. Salavine was listening. Our greatest strength is that we do not stop, not from stubbornness, although we are stubborn from something that doesn't have a word in your language. I paused. In ours we call it hope. It is not optimism, it is not confidence, it is something more functional than that. It is the working assumption that the problem in front of you is solvable, that the next thing you try might be the thing that works, and that therefore you try the next thing. We have been doing that for 40,000 years. We will probably do it for 40,000 more. Salavine was quiet for a moment. We reached the junction where the corridor split and he stopped and I stopped beside him. The data chip, he said, everything on it. Free to use, I said, no conditions, including the fold drive schematics. Cole's people built that, I said. You would have to ask him what conditions he wants. Salavine looked across the corridor to where Cole was walking. The Seth are technically still expelled, he said. Yes, I said, that seems like something worth reviewing. Salavine pressed both of his upper hands flat together, not against the dais, not in the formal gesture of closure, in a different way, a way that his cultural archive later told me was something closer to acknowledgement. Perhaps it is, he said. He turned and walked back toward the chamber. I watched him go. Pete appeared at my shoulder. What did he say? I think, I said, that the Seth are going to get a review. Pete looked at Cole's back, moving down the corridor. He's going to need some time to process that. Probably, I said. We can give him time. We're good at waiting when we need to be. We walked to the docking bay. The ship was where we had left it, which was always a slightly exciting confirmation after a visit to the council station. We filed on board our 8 Rook 4. Myra and 2 of her archivists who were coming back with us because they had decided that their skills were needed somewhere other than a council records archive. Cole and his colleagues were taking a different ship back to Seth space, which they could now technically re-enter, depending on how quickly the travel restriction review moved. I found my cabin. I sat on the bunk. I opened my notebook. The list titled Things We Have Now That We Didn't Have Before had run to well over 100 pages. I turned to a fresh page at the back. I wrote Seth reinstated pending review. I wrote Hall and archivists free. I wrote fold drive in 400 locations. I wrote embargo lifted. I thought about whether to write anything else. I thought about the woman in Cape Town who was probably still at her outdoor table or somewhere like it, passing something forward to the next set of hands. I wrote still going. Outside the window, the council station began to recede behind us, 3 stars, visible now that it had blotted out. Before, 3 stars that had always been there, that I had simply not been able to see from where I was standing. I thought about what Dan had said on the way here in the ship's small common area, while Pete and Nina were going over session protocols and the rest of us were trying to sleep. Dan had said, I have been in a lot of rooms where human beings were told that they were not enough. I have watched what happens after. I have never seen it in the way they expected. I had asked him what he meant. He had said, they always expect the not enough to stay not enough. They do not account for what happens when the not enough decides it is heard enough. The not enough turns out to be a very bad Prediction. I thought he was right. I thought he had been right from the beginning, sitting in the council chamber with his pen in his hand and his grief and his patience and his one small procedural rule saved for the right moment. I closed the notebook. The ship moved through the dark home, which was still there, still going, still full of people who would not stop. That in the end was the whole story. That was always the whole story.